The house on Wentworth Lane in Decatur, Illinois had been built in 1962 by a man named Gerald Puckett who had worked 30 years at the Caterpillar plant and poured everything he had saved into the lot: the foundation, the framing, the roof. Gerald Puckett had been dead since 1991 and the house had passed through 2 subsequent owners before Raymond Callister bought it in 1987 for $64,000, which in 1987 in Decatur was a reasonable price for a 3-bedroom house with a detached garage and a backyard big enough to grow tomatoes. Raymond had grown tomatoes every summer since. Not as a hobby exactly. More as a continuation of something he didn't have a name for, a relationship with the dirt and the season that his own father had practiced in rural Kentucky and that Raymond had absorbed without intending to, the way you absorb the things that surround you in childhood before you have the vocabulary to describe what's happening. He was 71 years old now. Had lived in that house on Wentworth Lane for 37 years. Had raised one son in it, watched that son grow from a boy who tracked mud through the kitchen into a man who wore suits and worked in Springfield and came home less and less, which was a trajectory Raymond had watched with the particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself because it arrives so gradually. His wife, Dorothy, had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosis to death in 7 months, which was its own specific cruelty. The speed of it, the way it didn't give you time to build toward the end but simply arrived and concluded. Raymond had been with her every day of those 7 months. Had driven her to the oncologist in Springfield twice a week. Had learned to cook the soft food she could manage when swallowing became difficult. Had slept lightly for 7 months, attuned to every sound from her side of the bed, not wanting to miss anything, not wanting her to need something in the dark and find him absent. He had been a mechanic for 34 years. His own shop, Callister Auto, on North Water Street, which he had opened in 1979 with a loan from his father-in-law and a second-hand lift that needed more maintenance than the cars he put on it. The shop had grown into something solid, not large, not famous, just the kind of neighborhood auto repair that people came back to because the work was honest and the prices were what they were and Raymond told you what was actually wrong rather than what generated the most billable hours. He had sold the shop in 2018 for years before Dorothy died, because his knees had decided that being under cars for another decade was not something they were willing to negotiate on. The retirement had been fine while Dorothy was alive. They had traveled some. Taken a train to Seattle. Driven down to Florida one winter to visit her sister in Sarasota. Sat on the back porch in the evenings watching the garden and talking about nothing important, which is one of the primary pleasures of a long marriage. After she died, the house had gotten very quiet. His son's name was Preston. Preston Callister was 43 years old and had been living in Springfield for 15 years. He worked in commercial real estate, specifically in the development side, acquiring and positioning properties for retail and mixed-use projects. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things that align with the specific way their brain is organized. He was comfortable with numbers, comfortable with negotiation, comfortable in rooms where everyone was measuring everyone else. He drove a black Mercedes GLE and wore shirts that were fitted in a way that communicated they had been fitted intentionally. He called his father on Sundays. Sometimes. More accurately, he called on roughly half of Sundays, and on the Sundays he didn't call, Raymond would sit with his phone on the kitchen table after dinner and not look at it, because looking at it was a kind of hoping, and hoping for something that wasn't coming was a habit he was trying to break. Preston visited Decatur 4 times a year. Roughly. Christmas if he wasn't with Melissa's family. Thanksgiving was variable. 1 visit in spring, 1 in fall, duration approximately 24 to 36 hours, which was long enough to establish presence and short enough to avoid the conversations that a longer visit would have made unavoidable. Melissa Crower was Preston's fiancée. She had been his girlfriend for 3 years before he proposed, and they had been engaged for 8 months. The wedding was scheduled for September at a venue outside Springfield that had a vineyard on the property and a rental fee that Raymond had been told about once and had not asked about again because the number had been large enough to produce a specific vertigo. Melissa was 39, worked in marketing for a healthcare company, and had the practiced friendliness of someone who spent significant professional energy managing how she was perceived. She was not unkind to Raymond in any active sense. She was cordial in the way that people are cordial with the aging parents of their partners when the aging parent represents an obligation rather than a person they would have independently chosen to know. She had never called Raymond by anything other than Mr. Callister, which after 4 years was its own form of distance. The situation with the house had begun 9 months ago. Raymond had had a fall. Nothing catastrophic, a step off the back porch that he misjudged in the dark, a fractured wrist and a badly bruised hip that had healed fully within 6 weeks. But the fall had triggered something in Preston's thinking, which was that his father living alone in a 3-bedroom house in Decatur was a liability that required management. The word Preston had used in a phone conversation 10 days after the fall was arrangement. He said they should think about a new arrangement for Raymond's living situation. Raymond had asked what kind of arrangement. Preston had said there were very good senior living communities in the Decatur area. Some of them were quite nice, he said, quite nice being the specific combination of words people use when they are trying to make something sound like an upgrade when they mean it as a reduction. Raymond had said he wasn't interested in a senior living community. Preston had said he understood that, but the fall had to be taken seriously. Raymond had said he had fallen off a porch step, not collapsed from organ failure, and that he was 71, not 91. The conversation had ended without resolution, which was how many of their conversations ended, and Raymond had thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. What had happened in the months between that conversation and March was a kind of incremental campaign that Raymond recognized only in retrospect, when he was able to lay the pieces next to each other and see the shape. Preston had called the family physician. Had spoken to Raymond's attorney, a man named Bernard Schultz who had been doing the family's legal work since 1994, about the status of the power of attorney documents. Had begun what he called research into options, which Raymond would later learn involved contacting 3 different assisted living facilities in the Decatur-Springfield corridor. In January, Preston had raised the subject again, more formally this time. He had a folder. He had printed materials. He sat across from Raymond at the kitchen table where Raymond had eaten breakfast for 37 years and laid out a proposal that included a specific facility in Springfield, an estimated monthly cost, and a plan for what to do with the house on Wentworth Lane. Raymond had asked what do with met. Preston said that maintaining the house made less sense once Raymond was no longer living in it. That the practical thing would be to sell. The house was Raymond's primary asset. The sale of the auto shop in 2018 had produced a reasonable sum that Raymond had invested conservatively. His Social Security and a modest pension from a union he belonged to in the early years provided monthly income. He was not wealthy, but he was not in need. He had, in the language of financial planners, enough, which is an underrated condition. The house was worth roughly $210,000 in the current Decatur market. It was also the place where Dorothy had hung her coat on the hook by the front door for 31 years. Where Raymond grew tomatoes. Where every room contained the sediment of a life he had built deliberately and slowly and with his hands. He told Preston he was not selling the house. Preston had said they should table the discussion for now and revisit it. What changed in February was Melissa. It was her idea, or it became her idea in the way that plans developed collaboratively later get attributed to one person. Preston had mentioned in whatever conversation they had about Raymond, that his father had a large house and that Preston had been managing the logistics from Springfield and that it was becoming a lot. Melissa, who had grown up in a household where resources were managed efficiently and where sentiment was not a category that interfered with practical decision-making, had said something that lodged in Preston's thinking and stayed there. She said the obvious solution was for Raymond to come live with them. Not in the Springfield apartment, which was a 2-bedroom condo downtown, but in the house they were planning to buy after the wedding, which was going to be larger. There was going to be room. What she meant, and what Preston understood, and what Raymond did not understand until much later, was that this arrangement solved multiple problems simultaneously. Raymond would not be alone in Decatur. Preston's guilt about the distance would be addressed. The house on Wentworth Lane would be sold, producing capital that Preston, as the only child and presumptive heir, had a long-term interest in. And Raymond's monthly income, the Social Security, the pension, would contribute to the household expenses of a house that Preston and Melissa were already planning to buy. They presented this to Raymond in late February as an act of generosity. Raymond had been surprised. He had sat with it for a week before saying anything, which was his habit with things that required thought. At the end of that week he said yes. He said yes because he was 71 and the house was quiet and the tomatoes were fine but they were not company. Because his son was offering something that looked like wanting him near. Because Dorothy was gone and Bernard Schultz was the closest thing he had to a close friend in Decatur, and even Bernard was slower to return calls since his own retirement. He said yes, and he put the house on Wentworth Lane on the market in March. It sold in 11 days. The Decatur market was moving. A young couple with a toddler and a second one on the way paid $207,000 and were clearly delighted, which Raymond was glad about because the house deserved people who would be delighted by it. He closed at the end of April. Bernard Schultz handled the paperwork. The proceeds, after the remaining mortgage balance of $31,000 and the agent's commission, came to approximately $168,000. Bernard had asked Raymond, quietly in the office on the day of the closing, whether Raymond had reviewed all his documents recently. His estate documents, the power of attorney, the account structures. He said it in the way that careful attorneys say things they are professionally prohibited from saying, more directly, with a certain deliberateness in the word recently, a pause after the question that was longer than the question required. Raymond had said yes, they were current. Bernard had nodded and said good. Just making sure. Raymond moved to Springfield in May. Preston and Melissa had bought a house in the Sherwood neighborhood on the north side. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a finished basement, a 2-car garage. It was a good house. Clean lines, well maintained, a backyard that backed up to a small green space. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that Springfield's north side neighborhoods were quiet, maintained, orderly, a certain demographic consistency that expressed itself in well-spaced mailboxes and basketball hoops with nets still attached. Raymond's room was on the 2nd floor. The smallest bedroom, which was still a reasonable size. His furniture from Wentworth Lane filled it partially. The bed, the dresser, the nightstand with the lamp Dorothy had picked out at an estate sale in 2006. He had brought books, his tools from the garage, which now sat in cardboard boxes in a corner of the new garage because there was no workbench, and the photograph from his and Dorothy's 30th anniversary that had hung in the kitchen in Decatur and now stood on the dresser because there was no wall space he felt comfortable claiming. He was careful. Deliberate. He understood that he was in someone else's house and he behaved accordingly. The first 2 months were tolerable. Not warm but tolerable. Preston worked long days and was often not home before 7. Melissa worked from home 3 days a week and was in the downstairs office, door closed for most of those days. Raymond watched television. Walked the neighborhood in the mornings, which was genuinely pleasant. Good sidewalks, mature trees, a park 4 blocks north with benches along the path. He cooked dinner twice in the first week, full meals, the kind of thing he had cooked for Dorothy and himself for decades. Pot roast, a chicken with vegetables, a soup from scratch. Both times Melissa had thanked him and then, over the following days, had reorganized the kitchen in a way that made it clear the kitchen was hers and cooking in it was an act of occupation rather than contribution. He stopped cooking. By July the texture of the arrangement had settled into something he was still trying to find the correct name for. He ate breakfast alone always because Preston and Melissa were out the door by 7:30. He ate lunch alone. Dinner was variable. 3 or 4 nights a week Preston and Melissa ate together, sometimes including Raymond, sometimes not explicitly excluding him but not including him either, the invitation delivered or not delivered in the ambiguous middle zone where intent is deniable. The money had been the clearest part. In June, Preston had proposed. The word he used was proposed as if it were a business arrangement, which it was, that Raymond contribute to the household expenses given that he was benefiting from the housing. Raymond had agreed. He had suggested $500 a month. Preston had said that given the mortgage and utilities and the cost of maintaining the household, $1,000 would be more appropriate. Raymond had agreed to $1,000. In August Preston had said that given the size of the house and Raymond's use of the space, they should revisit the number. He proposed $1,500. Raymond agreed to $1,500. Raymond's monthly income was $2,300. He did not mention this to Preston. In September Preston had raised the subject of Raymond's savings, the proceeds from the house sale, the invested funds from the shop sale. He had said, with the combination of briskness and warmth that he had clearly practiced, that it would make sense for Raymond to have his accounts structured in a way that allowed Preston oversight, given Raymond's age and the fall last year and the general principle of having a family member able to manage things if something came up. Raymond had said he would think about it. He had called Bernard Schultz from the park 4 blocks north, sitting on one of the benches along the path on a Tuesday morning in September while the leaves were just beginning their early turning. Bernard had listened, asked a few questions, had been quiet for a moment. Then he said Raymond should come to Springfield for a meeting. Not a phone call. A meeting. Raymond had not told Preston about the meeting. He took a cab to Bernard's Springfield office on a Thursday morning in October. Sat across from a man he had known for 30 years and listened to Bernard explain, with the careful language of someone who is being precise rather than alarmist, what it looked like from the outside. It looked, Bernard said, like a pattern. The house sold. The proceeds available. The monthly contributions escalating. The proposal for account access. The isolation, not dramatic, not locked in a room isolation, but the softer kind that happens when someone's world is reduced gradually and the reduction is naturalized as care. Bernard said there were legal frameworks for what Raymond was describing, if it came to that. He said Raymond should not change any of his account structures without independent legal counsel present. He said Raymond's power of attorney as currently written, did not grant Preston any authority that Raymond hadn't explicitly chosen to grant, and that Raymond should be very careful about any documents he was asked to sign. Raymond had sat with this for a moment. He asked Bernard to be direct with him. Bernard said he thought Raymond was being managed. He said he thought his son loved him in whatever way Preston was capable of love, but that the arrangement had been designed, consciously or otherwise, to consolidate Raymond's assets and reduce his independence, and that the two things were not mutually exclusive. Raymond had driven back to the house on the north side and eaten his lunch alone in the kitchen, which was a bowl of soup from a can because it was what was there and because cooking anything more required an engagement with the kitchen that no longer felt like his to make. He ate his soup and looked at the backyard and thought about the tomatoes on Wentworth Lane, which the young couple with the toddler were probably ignoring or had pulled out entirely to put in something more contemporary, and he didn't blame them, they had their own life to build, but he sat with the loss of it for a minute because it was worth sitting with. Then he called his wife's sister in Sarasota, a woman named Gloria Trent who was 68 and direct in the way that women become direct when they have lived long enough to stop having time for circumnavigation. Raymond and Gloria had always gotten along in the specific way of people who are bonded not by blood but by mutual love of a third person. He told Gloria what was happening. All of it, in sequence, without editorializing. Gloria listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, she said she had been wondering when he was going to call. She had been watching what was happening from Florida with the clarity that distance sometimes provides. She said she had not said anything because it was not her place and because she had hoped she was wrong. She said she was sorry she wasn't wrong. She said she knew someone Raymond should talk to. The someone was a woman named Harriet Odom. Harriet Odom was 66 years old and had been a circuit court judge in Sangamon County, Illinois for 19 years. She had retired from the bench 18 months ago and had moved from her home in Springfield proper to a smaller house on Renwick Road, which was 7 blocks from the house in the Sherwood neighborhood where Raymond was living. She was Gloria's college roommate from their years at Illinois State in the early 70s. They had remained friends for 46 years through the full geography of adult life. Marriages, children, careers, losses, the periodic phone calls that cover all of it in an hour and then let years pass until the next one. Gloria called Harriet on a Thursday evening. Harriet listened. She said she would stop by. It was a Saturday evening in late October when this happened, and the specific texture of that evening matters for understanding why everything arranged itself the way it did. Preston had a client in from Chicago, a developer named Todd Wingfield who was evaluating a mixed-use project in Springfield's East Corridor and who had flown down for the weekend to see the site and do the relationship building that development deals require. Preston had planned a dinner at a restaurant called Vino Carta on South 5th that was the kind of place in Springfield that people chose when they wanted to imply a certain standard without having to be in Chicago to do it. He had told Raymond about the dinner on Thursday. Had said it was a business dinner, important client. Had not said Raymond was welcome to join them. Raymond had not expected to be welcome to join them. What Raymond had not anticipated was the logistics. On Saturday morning Melissa had gone through the kitchen. She was preparing for the following week. Meal prepping, she called it, the practice of cooking in advance that their household had organized around. She had made several dishes and portioned them into containers in the refrigerator. She had put a label on one of the containers that said Dad's with a small arrow, which was what she called Raymond when she was managing him logistically rather than interacting with him as a person. The container said Dad's and it contained soup. Not homemade soup. Not even particularly good canned soup. It was a vegetable broth with some pale carrots and a bit of noodle, thin in the way that things are thin when they have been made with minimal rather than an attempt at adequacy. There was one portion. It was in the refrigerator next to the meal prepped containers for Preston and Melissa's week. A bolognese, a grain bowl situation, something in a glass container that appeared to involve chicken thighs. Raymond stood at the open refrigerator for a moment. He took out the container labeled Dad's. He heated it on the stove in a small pot, the way his mother had heated soup in Kentucky when he was a child, standing at the stove and stirring without urgency because the soup would be done when it was done and not before. He poured it into a bowl and carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. Through the kitchen window he could see the backyard in the late afternoon light of October, which in Springfield is a specific amber that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than happening. He ate his soup. Preston and Melissa left at 6:15. He heard the Mercedes back out of the garage. Heard the garage door come down. The house was quiet. He washed his bowl. Dried it. Put it away. He went upstairs to his room and sat in the chair by the window. Not the chair from Wentworth Lane, that chair was in storage. This was a chair from a guest room set that matched the aesthetic of the house rather than any preference of Raymond's, and he read. He was reading a biography of Dwight Eisenhower that he had started in September and was getting through slowly because he could only read for about 40 minutes before his eyes wanted a rest. He was on page 212 when the doorbell rang. He looked at the clock. It was 7:43 in the evening. He went downstairs. He opened the front door and there was a woman on the porch he had never seen before. She was in her mid-60s, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture was read as information. She was wearing a dark coat and carried a canvas bag over one shoulder. Her eyes were the kind that assess quickly without appearing to assess. She said his name. First and last. He said yes. She said her name was Harriet Odom. She said she was a friend of Gloria Trent's. She said Gloria had told her something was happening that warranted a conversation. Raymond looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door wider and said, "Please come in." She came in. He took her coat. Led her to the living room, the formal one at the front of the house that Preston and Melissa used for company and that Raymond rarely entered because it did not feel like a room he was supposed to use casually. He offered coffee. She said yes. He went to the kitchen and made it, the real kind in the drip machine, not the pod coffee Melissa preferred. He brought 2 cups and sat across from her. She put the canvas bag on the cushion beside her. From it she removed a legal pad and a pen. Not a laptop. A legal pad, yellow, the kind that judges and lawyers of a certain generation trust more than screens. She said she had heard from Gloria and she wanted to hear from him. She said she was not there in any official capacity, she was retired from the bench and had no authority to compel anything. She said she was there as someone with a specific kind of experience and knowledge who had been asked by a mutual friend to have a conversation. Raymond told her everything. He was precise, in the way that a man who spent 34 years diagnosing mechanical problems had learned to be precise. He gave her sequences, not impressions. This happened in February. This was said in June. This was the number in August. This was what Bernard had said in October. He told her about the soup in the labeled container in the refrigerator. He told her where Preston and Melissa were having dinner right now. Harriet Odom wrote on the legal pad and asked questions that were specific and that moved efficiently from one point to the next. She asked about the power of attorney documents. About whether Raymond had signed anything related to the accounts since moving to Springfield. About the exact language of the monthly contribution arrangement. She asked if he had the original sale documents from the Wentworth Lane house. He said Bernard Schultz had copies. She wrote something. Put the pen down for a moment. She asked Raymond what he wanted. Not what he wanted legally. Not what he wanted in terms of outcome. What he wanted. Raymond looked at his coffee cup for a moment. He said he wanted his life back. He said that was a simple way to put something complicated, but it was accurate. He said he wanted to make decisions about his own days. He said he wanted to grow tomatoes. He said he wanted to not eat thin soup out of a labeled container while his son ate lobster 20 minutes away. He said he wanted to stop feeling like a problem that had been relocated. Harriet Odom looked at him. Not with pity. She was not a person who trafficked in pity. It had been baked out of her by 19 years on the bench where pity was not a useful instrument. She looked at him with the attention of someone who has heard many people describe many situations and who has developed the ability to hear what is being said beneath what is being said. She said she wanted to tell him some things. She said the arrangement as he had described it had features that a court would find significant if it came to that. The escalating financial contributions. The house sale undertaken shortly after the power of attorney conversation. The account access request. None of these things were, individually, necessarily actionable. Together, in a documented sequence, they constituted what elder law referred to as a pattern of financial exploitation, which in Illinois was both a civil matter and, at certain thresholds, a criminal one. Raymond absorbed this without changing his expression. She said that didn't mean it had to go to court. She said that in her experience, which was considerable, the people engaged in this kind of behavior, and she was careful about the word she used the word behavior rather than the word people, frequently altered their behavior significantly when it became clear that someone with a specific kind of knowledge was paying attention. She said she knew Bernard Schultz. She said Bernard was a good attorney and had clearly been signaling to Raymond as strongly as he professionally could without overstepping. She said she thought Bernard would be glad to know Raymond had made this conversation. She said Raymond had rights. Not abstract rights. Specific, enumerated, legally protected rights as an adult resident of this household, as the owner of his own assets, as a person who had sold his home under representations that created certain reasonable expectations about the arrangement he was entering. She said he was not trapped. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said he knew he wasn't trapped, legally. He said the thing that was hard was the other part. The part where this was his son. Harriet Odom was quiet too, for a moment that was respectful rather than empty. She said she understood. She said that was the part that the law couldn't fully address, and that she was sorry for it. She said love and exploitation were not always mutually exclusive and that the coexistence of the two was one of the more difficult things a person could be asked to navigate. She stayed for 2 hours. When Preston and Melissa returned from Vino Carta at 9:50, they came through the front door talking about something related to the client dinner. Melissa was laughing about something Wingfield had said. Preston was loosening his tie, and stopped in the doorway of the formal living room. There was a woman sitting across from Raymond. A woman Preston did not recognize, with a legal pad on her knee and a canvas bag beside her, who looked up at him and Melissa with the equanimity of someone who is entirely comfortable with the current configuration of the room and is waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up. Preston asked what was going on. Raymond said this was Harriet Odom, a friend of Gloria's from Florida. Harriet said good evening. She said she hoped they'd had a nice dinner. She said she had been having a very useful conversation with Raymond. Preston looked at the legal pad. His face did the thing that faces do when the brain is receiving information faster than the social mechanism can process it. He said it was nice to meet her. His voice had the quality of a man who is performing normality while rapidly assessing a situation he doesn't yet understand. Melissa said the same thing. Her eyes went to the legal pad and stayed there for a fraction of a second longer than was casual. Harriet said she didn't want to keep them. She said she and Raymond had covered what needed covering for the evening and that she would be in touch. She stood, picked up the canvas bag, smoothed the front of her jacket. She told Raymond she would call Bernard Schultz on Monday morning. She said he should call her if anything felt urgent before then. She gave him a card from the bag, a plain card, just her name and a phone number, the kind of card that people keep from professional habit long after the profession has ended. Raymond walked her to the door. She said good night and went down the porch steps and walked toward Renwick Road with the unhurried stride of a woman who had somewhere to go and knew how to get there. Raymond closed the door. He turned and Preston and Melissa were standing in the hallway. Preston asked who she was. Raymond said she was a retired judge. He said she had been a circuit court judge in Sangamon County for 19 years. He said she was a friend of Dorothy's sister and that she had stopped by because Gloria had asked her to. He said it the way you say things when you want the information to land with its full weight, without ornamentation. Preston's expression had gone somewhere that was neither the brisk warmth of the salesman nor the managed patience of the caregiving son. It was something underneath those, less composed, older. He asked what she had wanted. Raymond said she had wanted to hear about the living arrangement, about the financial contributions, about the account access conversation, about the house. The hallway was very quiet. He said they would talk about it tomorrow. He said he was going to bed. He climbed the stairs and went to his room and sat on the edge of the bed. His bed from Wentworth Lane, the one thing in the room that was entirely his, and sat there for a moment in the dark before turning on the lamp. The photograph of him and Dorothy at their 30th anniversary was on the dresser. He looked at it for a while. Dorothy in her blue dress. Raymond in the sport coat she had picked out at JCPenney and that he had initially objected to and then worn so often it had become the coat he reached for without thinking. Both of them slightly squinting because the photographer had put them facing west and the afternoon sun was in their eyes, and the squinting gave them both an expression that looked like they were trying to see something very clearly on the horizon. He thought she would have known what to do about all of this from the first week. Dorothy had always been the one who could see the shape of a situation before it had fully assembled itself. She would have said something about it in February, something precise and non-negotiable, and the whole geometry might have been different. But she was gone, and Raymond had had to find his way to this moment by a longer route. He was here now. The Monday call between Harriet Odom and Bernard Schultz lasted 40 minutes. Bernard called Raymond afterward and said the word thorough about Harriet with the specific emphasis of a man who is genuinely impressed by rigor. Preston came to Raymond's room on Sunday morning. He knocked, which he had never done before, and came in and sat in the chair by the window. Raymond was on the edge of the bed, and they had the conversation that they should have had before any of this, which was the conversation about what Preston had actually been thinking and what Raymond had actually been feeling and how large the gap was between those two things. It was not a clean conversation. It was the kind that has stops and restarts, where things are said that are partially true and then amended into more fully true, where the word love gets used and means several different things simultaneously and none of them are wrong exactly. Preston cried at one point. Not the performed emotion of someone managing optics. The other kind. He said he hadn't thought of it the way Raymond was describing it. He said he had thought he was helping. He said even as he said it he could hear the parts of it that weren't the whole truth, and he said he was sorry for the parts that weren't. Raymond listened. He said he believed him. He said he also believed that the thing Preston hadn't thought about was the thing that most needed thinking about, and that was the difference between caring for a person and managing a person, and that the difference was the person's own account of the experience, which Preston had never asked for. He said he was not going to sign anything about the accounts. He said he was going to find an apartment in Springfield. He said Bernard and Harriet were going to help him structure the finances in a way that was independent and protected. He said he hoped they could have a relationship that was a relationship rather than an arrangement. Preston said he wanted that. Raymond said then that was what they would work toward. He moved to an apartment on Carpenter Street in Springfield in January, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor with a balcony that faced east and caught the morning light. He put the Eisenhower biography on the nightstand. Hung the anniversary photograph in the kitchen. He could not grow tomatoes on the 3rd floor balcony, so he bought 2 containers and grew cherry tomatoes on the east side of the balcony in the summer, which was not the same as the backyard on Wentworth Lane but was its own thing, and the cherry tomatoes were unexpectedly good. He had dinner with Preston twice a month. They had found, in the aftermath of everything, a way of being with each other that was more honest than what had existed before, which was painful in the way that honest things sometimes are when they arrive late. Preston called on Sundays. Reliably, now, without the variability of before, which was something. Melissa was warmer than she had been. Not transformed, she was who she was, but warmer, in the way that people are warmer when they are no longer managing something and are instead, occasionally, simply present. Harriet Odom and Raymond had coffee every few weeks at a place on South Grand that she liked and that Raymond came to like because of the coffee and because of the conversation, which was wide-ranging in the way of conversations between people who have met under specific circumstances but turn out to have general affinities. She recommended books. He told her about cars, about what a carburetor did and why fuel injection changed everything, and she listened with the attention of someone who finds the mechanics of things genuinely interesting. Gloria came up from Sarasota in June. She stayed with Harriet, who had the room, and the 3 of them had dinner together twice. Raymond made pot roast the first time in Harriet's kitchen, using her pots which were unfamiliar but manageable. It was the first time he had cooked a real meal for people in a kitchen since Dorothy died, and the doing of it was strange and also not strange at all. Bernard Schultz called it a resolution, which was the legal word for it. Raymond called it returning to himself, which was not a legal word but was the accurate one. He was still in Springfield the following October. Still on Carpenter Street. Still walking in the mornings, still reading in the evenings, still watching the light change through the east-facing balcony window with the patience of a man who has learned that the light always changes, that the season always turns, and that it is enough to be present for it. The cherry tomatoes had long since been harvested and eaten. He was already planning where to put the containers next spring.